Am I going to regret not scripting this? We'll find out. Hi, welcome to Karen Talks Nonsense. My name is Karen, and today we are going to be wrapping up a video series that I've been doing about first civilizations. So far I've made 5 videos. They have covered Sumer, Egypt, China, Indus River Valley, and the Andean Mountain people. So those are our first civilizations that we're covering first. This time period of history that I've been covering is basically the Neolithic Revolution through about 2000 BC. So that's where we are. This episode is going to function as a wrap-up. We're going to do some points of comparison and some points of connection. Really, this video is going to be most useful to you if you are maybe looking for some ideas for a paper, though judging by the demographics on my videos, which are men over the age of 40, you are not looking to write a paper, but hey, if you're here and that's what you would like to do, this video should be useful for you. So today we're going to be looking at different comparisons between these first civilizations, how they related to each other, and how they took the changes that they have been making from the Neolithic Revolution to the Bronze Age, more or less, how those changes were different in these different areas, because these are all contemporaneous points in time, and then how they maybe were connected and how those connections led to a greater expansion in technology. You do not have to have watched all of my other videos to watch this one. I'm going to start this by doing just a quick, and my cats are fighting. Okay. This is Otto. He is my worst cat. I have 3. You might think that his name is Otto because of Bismarck or something historical and cool like that, but it's not. It's Otto from Rocket Power. You do not need to have watched my previous videos. I'm going to give a quick overview of each civilization and kind of the high points, and then we'll jump into our comparisons. First, let's talk Sumer. The civilization of Sumeria was between the Tigris and the Euphrates River in southern Iraq. This was a bunch of different city-states like Uruk, Lagash, and they all were small cities ruled by a king or by an oligarchy, and then they would fight wars with each other, and they were competing for the similar resources. They relied on canals and the flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers to flood a large area than what would normally be flooded by the river to grow wheat and barley. Over time, they struggled with salinization, which is when their ground got too salty, and so they were not able to produce as high of yields. And so they could not feed their populations. That mixed with an influx of warfare from the north, which is going to be the Anatolia region, and then what will eventually be the Babylonians. In the north, you have the Akkadians come in, but that's kind of a continuation of the same Sumerian culture because the Akkadians really adapted to the Sumerians. The civilization really fades into the background quite a bit once they've been conquered, and Old Babylon forums. We'll be covering them next year. That's the gist of Sumer as far as what you have to know for the purposes of this video. The next civilization that I covered is Old Kingdom Egypt. That's going to take us through the first dynasty in the Old Kingdom through, let's say, like the 10th. I went through the intermediate period a little bit, but that's kind of like a mismatch of dynasties anyways. The height of the Old Kingdom is going to be with the 4th dynasty, and you're going to have the pharaoh Snefru, and then you're going to have Khephren and Khufu and Menkaure. And those are kind of our big pyramid builders who did a lot of trade throughout the region and had a lot of military success. They were able to do a lot of mining expeditions. The things that we keep in mind from Egypt is that there was flooding with the Nile, but it was a very controlled flood and it was very seasonal. It was not as destructive as you're going to find with some of our other civilizations. With Old Kingdom Egypt also, because it originates in the south and goes north, because that's the weird thing about Egypt. It's a south-north flowing river, which most of the time it's a north-south, or at least in our northern hemisphere point of view, like we look at things from a north-south perspective. The way that the water flowed meant that the salt that accumulated in the ground was able to be pushed out, and so it went into the Mediterranean. They did not struggle with salinization the same way that Sumeria did or the Harappans did. The things to keep in mind for Egypt is that it keeps a relatively cohesive culture from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom until it really gets conquered towards the end of Egyptian dominance. So that's going to be like the third intermediate period where we stop seeing kind of that original
traditional Egyptian culture. But what we think of as Egyptian culture and Egyptian art styles all originate in the Old Kingdom. I'm really truncating here. The next civilization that we covered was ancient China. So that one only really got us through the Xia and the very early of the Shang, and it was mostly focused on northern China, but not so much because I don't think that southern China and the Yangtze River Valley is not equally as important as the North and the Yellow River Valley. It's just that ultimately the Longshan and Yangshao culture that came out of the North is very influential on Chinese culture, and it's where our early dynasties are going to be centered out of. So once we get to the next part of China, which is going to be with more of the Shang and the Zhou, we're going to still be in northern China, and they're going to have more influence over the south than vice versa. But at this time in China, both river valleys are going to be doing a lot of agriculture. The north is going to be where you're seeing more canals and group structure agriculture projects, where in the south, it's going to be a lot more single farmer led. They're going to be doing more of the rice paddies in the south, and up north you have wheat and barley being able to grow. Warfare is more common in the north, and that's going to be where you have your early walled cities and military, but there are still a lot of influences from the south, such with the lacquering of pottery, and also further north in Manchuria, there's influences up there that come into the Yellow River Valley and into Longshan and Yangshao culture. I guess I should say Yangshao and Longshan culture. Yangshao came first. And then also with China, you're going to have some of the biases, because from an archaeological standpoint, there's been a lot of bias in the Chinese record where they want Chinese culture to have come out of the Longshan and Yangshao cultures, and that like these naturally were the Xia and the Shang, and that it's kind of this unbroken chain of Chinese culture that originated from one point that is obviously fading in the record, because I'm a layperson and I am speaking about it. So there's been a lot more parsing of the record and a lot more archaeology that has been done in southern China. The Han Chinese ultimately link their origins to the Yangshao, Longshan, Xia dynasties, and not the Han people, but the Chinese government perhaps feels a little bit of bias. And you know, where governments are is where money is, and that's where research happens. So we're all at the whims of the grants that we can receive and where there is interest. Slowly but surely in China, there is more interest in archaeological digs in other locations, but for a large part of its history, it has been focused in the north. So that's kind of what I covered in the China episode. We're gonna get to more real fact the next time we go through China with the Zhou. The unfortunate thing about the Xia dynasty is we're not totally sure it was a real dynasty or if it's just kind of a mythologised beginning of China. But in any case, we move on to the Harappans, and I, because I'm such a small channel, getting 50 comments on a video felt like a lot, and I was a little like, oh, this is a lot more than I wanted. The comments I got, some of them were very kind and were people who were very, very passionate about the subject. And I did not quite realize there was as much debate in the Indian community. So I don't know if my video is really that helpful. I was really coming at it as what would be useful for a student of world history who's maybe like doing the first unit of first civilizations. I'm certainly not claiming to be an authority on Indian history, and you can watch my video and decide what you think about it and do some more research. Otherwise, there were a lot of people commenting that the script may have been cracked. As far as I could tell, that has not yet been submitted for peer review. I feel like I made a video that was more controversial than I meant it to be. Here are the basic outlines that is hopefully as uncontroversial as I can make it for this video, which is the Indus Valley Civilization is in modern day Pakistan and northern India. They were a fairly widespread civilization. They had limited access to wood, and so they did most of their building out of these very impressive uniform style bricks. They have a script that we have not been able to decipher yet, which has really limited the scope of history that can be said. So it's kind of prehistoric, even though it firmly exists in the realm of history. They had tons of connections with Sumerians, with Acadia. They did some great agriculture. They were doing the canal thing. They had to deal with flooding. They built some really large scale cities. There was a natural progression from less organized village life, where these villages were abandoned for the sake of much larger cities that were heavily planned. They had plumbing, which is amazing. I'm always team plumbing. Ultimately, the civilization fell probably due to drought and to a lack of resources. If the soil got overly salinized, or if they ran out of wood to burn so that they could use their kilns and make these wood-fired bricks. What happened to those people is a matter of debate. They may have migrated to the south and been the origin point of the Dravidian languages. They may not have been. There's a lot of debate there. And then finally, the Andean Mountain Civilization, which we just covered last week. I had a lot of fun researching that. The Andean Mountain Civilizations are kind of culturally, probably there were distinct cultures, but it's difficult to say because they were a pre-ceramic people, meaning they did not have pots. They did a lot of vertical zone agriculture. So because they were right on the coast, in the Andean Mountains, from the coast up to the mountains, they were able to grow a bunch of different things at different elevations without having to go too very far, which means that they were able to domesticate and specialize in a whole bunch of different plants. So you're going to be thinking things like potatoes and chilies and corn, maize. They were able to do quite a bit with their agriculture. There were some limits on how much agriculture they could do because they did not have large-scale draft animals like the other civilizations. They had the llama and the alpaca, which are not as useful for agriculture as, say, an ox or a donkey. But they are also renowned for their beautiful textiles, which really can't be beat, and for their stonework, which also really can't be beat. The seams that you can see in these ancient stoneworked buildings, it's really impressive. That's our overview. Moving on from quick overview and background, so you don't have to go watch 4 hours of other content if you don't want to, or however long that would be. And we're going to move on to some comparisons of civilizations. If I were your world history teacher, if I asked you to write an essay describing the differences between these, or to compare them in general. And I'm very much opposed to this idea that you just say there were tons of similarities and differences between cultures. I don't think that's very useful. I do think it's good to have a thesis statement in there if you're looking to write a paper. So what that means is, if we're starting with resources, what I would say is the Eastern Hemisphere had a real advantage over the Western Hemisphere when it came to resources that were readily available to building a civilization. In the Eastern, so you're going to have that whole Afro-Eurasia area, there were draft animals. So they had access to the ox, the water buffalo, the camel, the donkey, the horse. The horse is up in the steppes, but eventually he comes down. And those were great for agriculture because you can use them to carry heavy loads. Eventually you can attach a plow to them. You can use them for carts. And then also they're a really great food source. So if you have chickens, if you have cows, if you have sheep, if you have goats, if you have pigs, these are all over here. They are great protein sources where you're making that Paleolithic to Neolithic switch. So Old Stone Age to New Stone Age. Old Stone Age goes till about 10,000 BC. New Stone Age is what we're dealing with the Neolithic agricultural revolution. That's going to take place from 10,000 BC until, say, 3,000 BC. And then from 3,000 to 2,000, we're looking at the development of the Bronze Age. So that's where these first civilizations are really popping up and popping off, as the youths might say. So when it comes to having a protein source, which is what you're really looking at, Afro-Eurasia is going to have the advantage of a lot of domesticated farm animals that they can both use for purpose, for carrying heavy things, but also for food, getting a lot of calories in. And a lot of protein-packed calories too, without having to go hunting. Everyone has the ability to hunt, especially in the Americas, my goodness. How easy it is to obtain your protein, how much work, how much of a group of a civilization you can feed with your food sources really indicates how large your population is going to be able to grow. So if I'm talking about China, in the north, they're going to have wheat, they're going to have barley, and they're going to have ox. Pig. So you have all these domesticated, and for ox, really, it's the water buffalo. You're going to have all of these easily accessible protein sources, but also you're going to have a lot of grain. And it's grain that's very dense in calories. So another comparison you can make over into the western side of the continent, the Americas, is they don't have as calorically dense of a grain as what we're going to have over in Afro-Eurasia. They have corn, maize, which is not calorically dense compared to wheat and barley or rice. So these are great grains that they've got over here. They can feed a lot of people. It's not as labor intensive to grow it. Whereas when you're over in the Americas, you have your maize, but you're going to have to grow other things with it, legumes, squash, the potato eventually. The potato, so useful. A dense caloric packet. So they have the potato we would think of maybe as like the russet potato, but then they're also going to develop the sweet potato. You could eat nothing but potatoes and sweet potatoes and live. You would have all the nutrients that you need. That's what's going on with food and agriculture. That's the difference of what you're farming. Another resource difference you're going to have is wood. Really, a lot of these people are struggling with their wood, and that was almost a reason for them to grow militarily so they could do expeditions to get wood elsewhere. If you're looking at Egypt in the 4th dynasty, when they're so strong, so Snefru, who's the first builder of the pyramids, he sends out expeditions to Lebanon to get cedar, and he's very successful in that. And when you get towards the end of the Old Kingdom and they try to send out expeditions to Lebanon, they get turned away. They're not able to get wood, or at least they're not able to get wood for the same price. It costs them a lot more. And then if you are in Sumer, they also don't have access to like these huge beams of wood. When the Akkadians come in, they are able to successfully, Sargon the Great is able to successfully send troops into Lebanon to get cedar. And then when you're looking at like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is so important to the Sumerian and Akkadian culture, we think that when Gilgamesh and Enkidu go up into the Lebanon area and get all those cedars, they clear the forest and send it all back down to Sumer. We think that that's probably in reference or influenced at least by Sargon and the Akkadians. So you can see that the ability to get wood is an indication of a strong king in both Egypt and in Mesopotamia. In China, you're not really dealing with that same issue. Like there's wood, so the way that they construct their houses also is a little bit different. If you're in the Indus River Valley, you are also struggling with the lack of wood, and you're not using any of the wood that you have for construction purposes. You are using it to use fire for your kilns so that you can bake your bricks, and they build everything out of these bricks. And it's really, really impressive. So talk about using what you got for the most, and that's what they were doing there. The point that I would make within an essay or a comparison about that would be that because Egypt and Sumer did not have this resource, but they had lots of food so they could feed an army, they were able to send out a military in order to get the resources that they needed and bring them back. So that's kind of a pivotal level of organization that they were able to achieve. All right, let's talk about geography, because that's also different. In the Americas, you've got a really thin choke point in the middle in Central America. So there wasn't a ton of communication between Mesoamerica and the Andes. It really functioned as kind of a chokehold of information. So maize didn't get to Andes as quickly as you might think. It took a little bit longer. They weren't all communicating that much, and then the Mesoamericans were really not communicating further north. So pretty much everything gets stuck in Mexico and does not go further north. So the great civilizations that you think of with South America, you're going to have the Inca, the Aztec, the Maya. All of these stay very centrally located. Whereas when you're looking at Afro-Eurasia, it starts with Sumer, and then they're able to expand that information outwards. And it almost kind of is the center of the universe in a weird way. So information quickly spreads. They've got the Mediterranean, which once you learn how to traverse it, like the Phoenicians did or the Mycenaeans, once you're traversing the Mediterranean, it's very easy to trade and to share information. Over in China, we're a lot more isolated. They've got some natural barriers that prevent them from going further to the west. So they're able to form a much more culturally cohesive society, basically over the next 1,000 years, because they are more isolated. They have intermittent conversation with India, but that really kind of depends on the climate. And then with India, you have a whole bunch of migration groups. You have a bunch of people moving around. They are also able to do a whole lot of globalization. So when you think of who's talking to each other in this very early civilization period, really you could say from 3000 to 1500 BC, it's going to be India, Sumer, and Egypt are all talking to each other quite a bit and sharing technology, and it allows for a lot of expansion of technology. Whereas China's more isolated, they have to figure things out for themselves, and then obviously the Americas are very isolated and they have to figure out everything for themselves. But what that also means is when we're talking about huge levels of population and civilizations building, is you're going to have more warfare, which definitely existed. The more cool stuff that you build, the bigger your population is getting, the more competition for the cool stuff, the more that you're going to be dealing with raiders and violence and warfare. And that's not to say it did not exist in the Americas. It most certainly did, as did human sacrifice pretty much everywhere. I think all of these civilizations at some point had some form of human sacrifice. Maybe not the Harappans, but I know Egypt, off the top of my head, I know that Egypt, China, Sumer, and the Andes all did some form of human sacrifice. Also with the Indus, they don't show a ton of signs of warfare. So that's, another kind of interesting caveat to them. But everyone else is doing some warfare, especially in Egypt and in Sumer. And Sumer is one of the most warfare-driven communities, probably because they did not have a centralized state. They had city-states that were all competing for the same resources. They were always fighting. And therefore, they were always fighting. There was a much higher level of warfare. So the benefit of a centralized state is that it leads, generally speaking, to a more stable military life. So Egypt, even though there is a standing army and they do go on expeditions, and they are kind of geographically isolated and they are able to avoid a lot of external threats. Usually Egypt itself is not under threat. Usually they are going on an expedition and raiding them and then coming home. Whereas with Sumer, they're kind of at a location that a lot of people want. It's a good location, and they're dealing constantly with threats from the north coming down into them and having to defend that, along with fighting each other for resources, which is going to be agricultural land, access to the rivers, and walled cities. You might want to conquer it from your neighbors so that you have access to that population group, you have access to more slaves, you enslave the people that you conquer more or less, which pretty much all of them do. Negative of the ancient world is that we do see very quickly that slavery occurs. It is not based on race, like slavery that would eventually be that big problem in the Americas. It is slavery that is just based on we have conquered you and now you are a slave. And slavery doesn't really become based on race for a good long while. In the ancient world, you're a slave if we can take advantage of you and you can't defend yourself. Next, rivers that flood. All of these civilizations, really interestingly, deal with rivers that flood. And for some reason, this caused kind of a pressure point, I think, on which humans had to work together to solve a problem. And that problem was destructive flooding for the most part. So the least destructive of our floods are going to be in Egypt with the Nile. They are able to control it relatively easy and keep their civilization pretty much streamlined along the Nile. Not that you could live anywhere else if you really wanted to, unless you're a Bedouin community who's figured that out. The Egyptian civilization, it's staying on the Nile. It's very skinny. The flood happened yearly. It was managed. It was knowable. They did irrigation canals and were able to store water for that purpose. Those were community projects that were locally done. The river flooding and how much it flooded was considered to be the work of the gods, and whether or not the pharaoh was doing his job was greatly tied to how much the Nile rose. The higher it rose, the more water they had, the more agriculture they would get, more surplus, and they were able to store it or use it to feed an army if they needed to go do that, or feed a workforce if they are building a pyramid. So the inundation is a huge part of Egyptian culture. It's kind of the winter of their society, because once the inundation happens, you can't really do too much. That was when a lot of building projects for the pharaoh took place, because you had a large workforce that were not going to be farming at that time. They would be waiting for the floods to go down. In contrast to that, the Tigris and the Euphrates flooded really dangerously and really horribly and killed a lot of people. So they had to work together in order to control that flooding. And the offshoot of that was that they were able to form these cities and communities that were able to do some agricultural canal building, and then from that usually city-states would build around that agricultural work project. It's just so difficult and so labor intensive to build a canal. You're pretty much required to work with your neighbors in order to make it work, and that kind of same thought process is going to be true with the Indus River Valley. They both flood so destructively that you have to work together as a community in order to deal with it. And then when you look over at the Andean mountain civilizations, they also dealt with a good deal of flooding, though theirs had more to do with El Nino. And they would get an excessive rain every 5 to 7 years. It would cause a lot of destructive flooding, and their houses, generally speaking, would just be washed away. They did have irrigation canals. They did they had some 50 rivers and river valleys up in the Andes Mountain in Peru area and a little bit in Ecuador. And they were able to handle that from snowmelt. So they had regular snowmelt every year, and they were able to direct how their water flowed from that so that it was most useful for them. And also they notoriously actually were very good at land management and letting certain areas rest and paying attention to how long a field or a region needed to rest before they were attempting to grow on it again. But to keep in mind also, they had a much smaller population they were trying to feed. At most, it was like probably 50,000 in this time frame of to 2000 BC. Their cities probably weren't more than about 500 people at any given time. So that's really different than what you're seeing in the East. The commonality that you're going to see in all of these are going to be irrigation canals. And people working together in order to form those irrigation canals. Problem that you're going to see through various of these civilizations is, did they struggle with salinization? The ones who struggled the most are going to be the Indus River Valley and Sumer. While there is some struggle with it in other places, it's not to the same extent, especially considering that wheat is much more sensitive than barley when it comes to your growing seasons. Okay, from salinization, let's start talking about architecture, which is something else that requires a great deal of community involvement in order to do. A civilization is really marked by their architecture, and what's interesting is that there are a lot of similarities here. Egypt and the Andes Mountain people are really known for their stonework, so they're going to be the ones who are doing a great deal of mining and of finding, really complex ways to move really huge amounts of rock. There's not really a way to do it other than extreme amounts of hard labor. Similarly, with the Andean Mountain Civilization and China, they are going to be doing these mounded platforms, dirt platforms, where they're learning how to stamp down earth and do a certain amount of terracing. They're able to do a lot of agriculture on these kind of extended terraces. So the rice paddies specifically in southern China are terraced. And then the kind of question is also, did they do any form of brick or stone? And you're going to find that in Sumer and the Harappans. An interesting contrast between all these is how they did their grave goods. So with the Indus River Valley, it was a really limited grave good. They did not bury a ton of things with their dead. With Egypt, Sumer, and China, your grave goods were really indicative of your elite role in society. So Egypt is the obvious one to point to when it comes to grave goods, because they had pharaohs with pyramids and they buried a lot of really cool stuff with their pharaohs because they believed that everything that you would need in the next life you had to have buried with you. In Sumer, it's more of a similar way of life there, where kings are buried with a whole lot of stuff. And then in China, this gets greater, especially once we're with the Han. There's a ton of really great examples, but that's 400 CE that we're talking about with the Han. So that's a long time from now. But grave goods are going to be important, and ancestor worship is going to be important really pretty early on. And how much is buried with one individual, you're going to start seeing, especially with the Shang, that you get greater grave goods the more elite the person is, and whether or not it's considered that they're going to be an ancestor that we are venerating or not. And then what I really like about certain cultures, this is a universal thing with the Andes, is that they practiced mummification, much like the Egypt, but their grave goods actually seem to be more dependent on the future that was lost somewhat. So a child sometimes has better grave goods than a full adult person, which I think is really touching that they put so much emphasis on their young. But even in China, you have some burials of very young children who are wrapped in silk. This is one of the earliest silk textiles that we have from China, is actually a shroud that a child was buried with. I always find that anything to do with very young children humanizes ancient cultures, that they did love their children just the way that any parent would, and that they were probably devastated by the loss of a young child, and that they buried them with care and with dignity and with things that they might need for the next lives. I mean, even, and this is New Kingdom, Egypt, but Tutankhamun, in his tomb, there are even burials of probably what were miscarried children of him and his wife, Ankhesenata. And it's just so touching to me that parents were always mourning the loss of those very young children, expressing human grief so clearly. Because, we don't really know too much about these people's individual lives, but we can see that what it means to be human continues on through these people. We can really reflect a lot of our own fears and pains onto these people and see that they were still there. So the fear of death, the curiosity of what's going to be in the afterlife, the loss of a child or a family loved one who is greatly missed. The way that your life goes on after that person is difficult. And so trying to find a way to honor the dead and to honor ancestors and believe that they're looking out for you in the afterlife, that's reflected just as much in Chinese culture as it is in Egyptian. But what this also can tell us is that as wealth in society increases, it becomes less egalitarian within that society. So you're going to see that in China, it begins relatively egalitarian, and then as time goes on, by the time you're getting to the Shang, it's much less egalitarian. And with that, fewer rights are attributed to women and farmer, agrarian type classes. And with specialization of skills, you're going to see that more importance is levied towards some skills than others and some contributions than others. If you can be a jewelry maker or a metallurgist, or you are really great at constructing pots, if you are a scribe and can write, if you can make really beautiful textiles, if you can do these skills, there is more importance that's placed on them. And you do get paid more for a very specialized craft. And, in the same way that you think of someone moving to the big city for more opportunity, that happens in the ancient world as well. The reason people move to Ur is for more opportunity. What's going to separate a society from being egalitarian and move it towards a more elite style culture where certain people are in charge and there are more clear class distinctions, where it's the agriculturists, the artisans, and then kind of an elite ruling class that's probably made up of priests or people who can read and write. And then at the very top, you're probably going to have a king or some sort of centralized power. What's going to move you in that direction is going to be globalization and connection. And how that looked in the ancient world pretty much varied, but let's start there. Trade's going to start more localized in between different city-states. So you're going to have that with Sumer among all of their city-states that they were communicating, but then they're going to be able to start sending their stuff out further abroad. So you're going to have them going north into the more Mediterranean area and the Russian steppe. You're going to have them going through the Persian Gulf out into eventually India, into the Harappans, and then over into Egypt also for their trade. And that means that they're talking to these people and trading ideas and getting a lot more wealth because they're able to do all this trade. And then with Egypt, they're going to be able to trade south into Africa. They're kind of this hub of trade that will eventually change with, say, Axum, which is further south in Africa. And that one in the Roman Empire or in the Greek Empire, Axum is going to be a center of international trade and kind of one of those choke point places where a lot of things come through. And then the Harappans are going to be doing trade with Sumer, and then they're going to be going up into Iran and the steppe also. China is going to exist in a much more isolated state, but this area is so large that they don't necessarily need to trade or over into the east. We don't need full Silk Road globalization yet because there's plenty to trade and learn about within these small cultural communities that are existing within China. This is a huge land area to be dealing with, even with the Manchu up in the north, the Longshan, the Yangshao. But there were several Neolithic cultural groups that eventually will be encompassed by the Shang and the Zhou. But to start with, they are a bunch of distinct cultural groups that are able to trade with each other. In China, lacquering is a great example of something that originates probably in the south, but then makes its way up north, and then everyone starts lacquering their pottery. So it's a skill that gets learned from a different culture. And then eventually gets encompassed into all of Chinese culture. The biggest transition that is going to be occurring is going to be the Bronze Age. So we're going to have metallurgy becoming really significant and really important. It comes a little later in China, with the Xia, there isn't a ton of indication of bronze, but once you get to the Shang, there is a great deal of bronze. So that's post 1800 that we're going to be looking at that. And then with the Harappans and Sumer, what I find so interesting is that they needed each other to have a successful Bronze Age. So one has copper, one has tin, and then they're able to trade with each other and get the components that they need to make bronze. Both were able to have a really successful Bronze Age because they were able to trade with each other. In Egypt, they also had a successful Bronze Age. They were able to get a lot of their minerals out in Sinai, which had a plethora of stuff for them. And so that's kind of my spiel. The final thesis statement I would give is that what resources you start out with are really significant in how quickly you can build a civilization, and then how able you are to trade with other people and perform agriculture is really going to be significant. So with the north-south geography of the Americas, it's a little bit more difficult to communicate with your neighbors. You're going to be lacking a lot of draft animals, so it's a little bit more difficult to do large-scale agriculture and to have a domesticated protein source for your community. So what Peru had over Mesoamerica is the guinea pig, which is like a fun little protein packet, and they're really easy to grow. Whereas in Mesoamerica, they had dogs as a domesticated animal. It's difficult though. That's hard to get a lot of protein. And you're also at a disadvantage when it comes agriculturally to, you've got maize, but you don't have a grain like rice or wheat or barley. Whereas when you're looking over here at the Afro-Eurasia, you've got kind of more of an east-west geography, so trade is a lot easier, the sharing of information is a lot easier, you've got a lot more animals, and you've got the grain. But, the cost of the grain is bad teeth, and that's what the Neolithic Revolution also gave us. With trade comes an increase in power structures. Increased agriculture comes power structures. What we can take away from first civilizations is that, generally speaking, a civilization formed where there was some sort of pressure point. So that's where you have your Neolithic farmers who are having to work together to grow something bigger so that they can stay in that same sedentary position that they have decided to start staying at for purposes of agriculture. And then once they have made their way through that agricultural growing pain, because it is kind of a growing pain, they start going into specialization of skills. They start having more complex pottery and jewelry and weapons and textiles, and then they're able to use those in a larger scale trade. They're able to start making more money and having more things because they've specialized, and they can feed a larger population. They might have a standing army because they can feed that army with a surplus of food. They have to decide whether or not they're going to be a centralized state power. So that's going to be with the dynasties in China with the Mandate of Heaven, or with the pharaoh that is a centralized power in Egypt, or if they're going to go the city-state route, which is what we have in Sumer. We're not so sure with Harappa. That might have been like oligarchic elite class that was ruling over a large region. It doesn't appear there was a king. Then what you're going to be dealing with are outside forces that are probably putting pressure on you. And sometimes you fall to that outside pressure, which is going to be what happens with Sumer. They fall in somewhere around 2100, and that's when you're going to see Old Babylon start rising up. Or if you're Egypt, you go through an intermediate period where the centralized state collapses, but you still remain relatively Egypt and you're still self-run, but it maybe becomes more localized. But then when we get to the Middle Kingdom, that's going to be the centralized state regaining power. In China, you're going to see kind of rises and falls of centralized states. So once the centralized state gets weak, that's when an opposing force comes along and says, I'm the new centralized state. The ancestors have abandoned that one. I'm the new guy, and I am now the dynasty. And so Mandate of Heaven has moved on to a new family, new dynasty. We don't really know for Harappa, and we don't really know for the Andean Mountain Civilization how their power structures worked, but maybe we will eventually. All of this to say that this is first civs, this is how they generally functioned, especially compared to each other. This has gotten us to about 2000 BC. Our next area of study is still going to be ancient civilizations, and that's going to be, we're going to be looking at civilizations from 2000 to 1000 BC. That'll probably take us a whole year to get through, frankly, the rate that I'm making these. We are going to be doing the Minoans, we're going to be doing Old Babylon, we're going to be doing the Olmecs, we're going to be doing Middle Kingdom Egypt. We're going to get to the Zhao, but that's at the end here. We'll get to Israel, that's at the end. If you have a specific society or civilization you would like to cover that had their heyday in, say, 2000 to 1000 BC, let me know, leave a comment, and I may add it to the list. Thank you so much for watching this wrap-up of Season 1 of Hogwash History. Thank you for watching First Civs, and I look forward to 2025, where we will be covering Season 2, which is going to be just Ancient Civ. I'll see you next time. Bye.